I woke up on Thanksgiving morning to a silence so complete, it felt like the walls were listening. This house was never quiet on a holiday. I'd grown up with the clatter of pots before sunrise, the thump of my father's heavy steps, my mother opening and closing cabinets like she was conducting an orchestra, and my sister Sophie blasting whatever pop song she was currently obsessed with. But that morning, the kind of morning usually filled with warm chaos and cinnamon, and voices, the air felt hollow, too hollow. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping off my shoulders, and realized I couldn't hear anything at all. No coffee machine sputtering, no footsteps, no TV humming from the living room. Not even the creak of floorboards that always betrayed someone moving around. I swung my legs over the bed, a growing tightness in my chest. Something wasn't right. Thanksgiving isn't supposed to feel like an abandoned building before dawn. I pushed my hair out of my face and stepped into the hallway. Cold air drifted against my skin, making me shiver. The house felt wrong, like someone had wiped it clean of life in the middle of the night. I walked toward the stairs, pausing at the top to listen again, hoping to catch even a whisper of movement. Nothing. Not even Sophie's usual morning complaints, or the scrape of my mother's slippers. I went down the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, trying to convince myself that maybe everyone was just out for a sunrise walk or picking up something from the store. But as soon as I reached the bottom step, I saw the truth. The living room looked like a staged photo in a magazine. Too neat, too untouched. The throw blankets were folded like they'd never been used. The rug looked freshly vacuumed. There wasn't a single mug crumb or sign that a family of 4 had been living here yesterday, and the air smelled faintly of bleach, which was strange because my mother only deep cleaned before guests came over. Certainly not at 3 in the morning. My heartbeat started to thud in my ears. I walked into the kitchen, letting my eyes scan the countertops. Empty, sparkling, wrong. My mother always left something out overnight when she planned to cook early. Butter softening, spices lined up, a bowl or two. But everything had been tucked away, wiped down, erased. I stepped toward the coffee maker and placed my hand on the glass pot. Cold. That was when my gaze drifted to the driveway through the kitchen window. 2 empty oil stains. 2 empty parking spots. Both cars gone. My father's silver Subaru, my mother's navy SUV. I blinked hard, hoping I was misinterpreting something. But the truth sat there as plain as the morning light. They were gone. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, hugging my sweater around my arms. The air was sharp, the kind that made your breath cloud in front of you. The driveway glistened slightly from last night's rain, and the clean rectangles where the cars had been parked told me they'd left hours ago, long before I woke up. When I closed the door behind me, the click echoed too loudly. It felt like I'd been locked into someone else's life. I walked back into the kitchen, hoping, praying there was some explanation waiting for me. Maybe they left a list, a note, a message, saying where they'd gone so early on a holiday morning. Then I saw it. A single folded piece of paper on the counter, pinned by the little turkey magnet we'd used since I was a kid. No name written on the outside. No handwriting style that felt familiar at first glance. I picked it up with hands that felt too cold and unfolded it. Claire, we flew to the Maldives. It's a family trip. You wouldn't enjoy the flight. Back in 10 days. Mom once stared at the words until they blurred. The Maldives. A family trip. Without me. A decision made without discussion, without warning, without even the courtesy of waking me up before leaving the country. I read the line again. You wouldn't enjoy the flight. Like I was a fragile object. Like they'd done me a favor by excluding me. Family trip. The words stung worse than the cold air. I set the note down slowly, almost afraid it might burn my fingers. I swallowed hard and looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd spent my entire life being the reliable daughter. The helper. The background character. I reached for the fridge handle, and when I pulled it open, it hit me that the usual leftover container shelf was empty. They'd cleared it out, prepared for their vacation. I walked into the hallway and checked the bench where Sophie always dumped her backpack. Empty. The hooks on the wall where coats usually hung were bare. My father's fishing cap was gone. My mother's oversized tote was missing from its spot by the door. Every sign of them had been removed. Prepared, planned. The realization crept in slowly, cold and crawling. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a mix-up. This was intentional. I went upstairs to Sophie's room and gently pushed the door open. Her bed was made something she never did. The vanity was cleared except for makeup brushes that had been organized by size, definitely not her doing. I saw a packing list on her desk, half crumpled. Packing list: swimsuits, beach dresses, chargers, Maldives, sunscreen flights. 3 seats only, 3 seats only. I ran my thumb over the words, the letters shaking under my touch. My room was next. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed things were off. My jewelry box drawer wasn't fully closed. My passport, usually tucked inside my nightstand, was missing. Clothes that were normally folded were moved. Someone had gone through my things. I sank onto the edge of my bed as the truth sank into me harder than anything had in years. They didn't just leave without me. They prepared to leave me behind. They cleaned. They organized. They erased their tracks. They slipped out while I slept, making sure I wouldn't wake up in time to see them leave. I stood up again, forcing myself back downstairs. The house felt colder now, emptier, like a museum after hours. I stared at the note still sitting on the counter. The handwriting looked rushed, detached. The signature wasn't even how my mother normally signed her name. I picked it up again, reading it one more time. We flew to the Maldives. It's a family trip. You wouldn't enjoy the flight. A tiny, bitter laugh escaped me. The Maldives. A luxury vacation. A perfect postcard island. A place I'd dreamed of visiting someday. And they left me behind with the excuse that I wouldn't enjoy the flight. As if the flight was the problem. I set the note down gently and leaned both hands on the counter, grounding myself. The clock above the stove ticked softly. The refrigerator hummed. The world moved on, utterly indifferent to the fact that my family had boarded a plane without me. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle like a stone at the bottom of a pond. They didn't forget me. They didn't overlook me. They chose to leave me out. When I opened my eyes again, something in my chest felt different. A crack. A shift. A breath I hadn't taken in years found its way out of my lungs. This wasn't a misunderstanding, I whispered. This was intentional. And standing in that silent house, with nothing but a cold note on the counter and an empty driveway outside, I finally understood the first truth of what was coming. This was only the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table far longer than I meant to, staring at the note, as if the ink might shift and reveal some hidden meaning. But the words stayed the same, cold, clipped final. Finally, I pushed the paper away and let out a long breath, one that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my ribs. How did I become the disposable one? I murmured to the empty room. And just like that, memories I thought I'd buried began rising one by one as if summoned. I used to believe my childhood was normal. Maybe every kid thinks that until they're grown enough to see the edges. But looking back now, I can trace the beginning of everything to years I once called simple, ordinary. The truth is, those years set the stage for this moment, the moment I found myself alone in a house that was never really mine. When I was 8, my grandmother, my dad's mother, once bent down, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and whispered, "You're a bright girl, Claire. Don't let the world make you small." I didn't understand it then. I thought she was just being kind. I didn't realize she was warning me. I was 11 when I began noticing the shift. Sophie had just turned 4, loud and adorable and soaking up every ounce of attention in the room. My mother used to beam at her the way sunlight falls through a window, warm, generous, effortless. At me, though, her smile was different. It always carried a hint of expectation of something she needed me to do before I had earned affection. Dad wasn't much better. He'd ruffle Sophie's hair, call her his princess, But when he turned to me, he called me reliable like it was a compliment. Maybe it was, but when you're a kid, reliable feels a lot like useful. I remember sitting at the dinner table in 7th grade, clutching a math test with a big red C on it. My stomach twisted as I handed it to my father. He adjusted his glasses, sighed loudly, and said, "You have to do better, Claire. Look at your sister. She's going to go farther than you ever will." Sophie was 7. She was coloring at the table, humming to herself, not even aware she'd just been held up as the golden standard. I sat there quietly, feeling something tight and unpleasant curl inside me. I told myself he didn't mean it. I told myself lots of things back then. I think that was the year I realized love in our house wasn't the same temperature for everyone. By the time I hit high school, I was already used to being the responsible one. If there was an event, I was expected to help set up. If Sophie had rehearsal, I was expected to tag along. If something needed fixing, I was the one who figured it out. And when I asked my mom if I could try out for the school talent show, she didn't even look up from folding laundry. Sweetie Sophie has her recital that night, you know that, and will need help backstage. Don't make things harder. I nodded and swallowed disappointment so easily, it barely tasted like anything at all. The older I got, the more familiar the line became. "Don't make it about you, Claire." They said it casually, the way people comment on the weather. But over time it carved something into me. A belief that taking up space was an inconvenience. That needing anything made me difficult. That I existed to support, not to shine. I didn't question it, not back then. I just learned to stay quiet. One evening near the end of high school, I was walking down the hallway when I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. The tone made me pause. It wasn't angry. It was resigned, the way people speak when they're planning for the future. "Claire isn't as gifted," my dad said. "She's a hard worker, but Sophie has potential." My mother sighed. "Well, of course. Sophie's special. Claire is steady, useful, reliable, never special." I froze on the carpet, staring at the wall, the edges of my vision blurring. It didn't hurt the way I thought heartbreak would hurt. It just felt heavy. Like someone had placed a stone inside my chest and told me to carry it forever. I didn't confront them. I just went back to my room, finished my homework, and kept being the steady daughter they wanted. In college, I stayed close to home because the family needs you nearby. I told myself I agreed. That I wanted to be the supportive one. But the truth was, I didn't know how to choose myself without feeling selfish. Sophie went to a private performing arts high school. My parents praised every small achievement she had as if she'd invented talent. Whenever I shared news from my classes, grades, projects, accomplishments, my mother's reaction was always the same. "That's nice, Claire. Now could you drop Sophie off at rehearsal tonight?" After a while I stopped sharing. There wasn't a single mug crumb or sign that a family of 4 had been living here yesterday, and the air smelled faintly of bleach, which was strange because my mother only deep cleaned before guests came over. Certainly not at 3 in the morning. My heartbeat started to thud in my ears. I walked into the kitchen, letting my eyes scan the countertops. Empty, sparkling, wrong. My mother always left something out overnight when she planned to cook early. Butter softening, spices lined up. Looking back, I see now that I wasn't loved more easily. I was simply loved less loudly. I became good at filling in the gaps, driving them everywhere, covering missed errands, helping with chores when they were tired, taking grocery lists scribbled in the margins of envelopes and making meals appear like magic. And whenever I hinted that maybe I deserved a break or space or simply acknowledgement, I always heard the same thing: "We're counting on you, Claire." Sometimes when I think of those years, I imagine a younger version of myself standing in a hallway like a ghost. Barely seen. Almost heard. Useful but invisible. There was one night near the end of college when my mom had a stressful phone call. Money, worries, bills, Sophie's new extracurriculars. When she hung up, she rubbed her forehead and said to me, "We'd be lost without you." But the tone wasn't gratitude. It was ownership. As if my usefulness bound me to them. As if needing me guaranteed I would never leave. And I didn't leave. Not then. I took jobs nearby, helped Sophie practice lines for school plays, cooked Sunday dinners, cleaned the house when my parents were overwhelmed, kept my voice small, my needs smaller, but every now and then someone would slip. My mother once complained to a neighbor over coffee, not realizing I could hear her from the hallway. She means well, but everything has to be done her way. Sometimes it's easier to just work around her. Work around me. Like I was an obstacle in my own home, Sophie was worse. She learned early that being the baby gave her power. She'd talk about me like I wasn't in the room, rolling her eyes and saying Claire's so dramatic, or Claire gets upset over nothing, and my parents always brushed it off. She's sensitive, Mom would say. Don't pick on her. Sensitive, dramatic, overreacting. All the ways you tell someone their feelings don't matter. Years of those little cuts added up. They turned into something sharp inside me, something I ignored for too long, something I didn't understand until this morning, standing in the kitchen with that note. A family trip. 3 seats. The Maldives. Not me, never me. I sat back at the kitchen table and felt the weight of all those years pressing down. The moments where I convinced myself it wasn't favoritism. The times I swallowed my feelings whole. The times I chose silence because I thought silence meant love. Maybe this cold, quiet house was always where I was going to end up. Not because I failed my family, but because long before they left me behind, they taught me to expect it. I took a slow breath, let it out, and looked again at the note. My mother's rushed signature, the casual cruelty of, "You wouldn't enjoy the flight." The simplicity of their decision. And, for the first time that morning, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt awake. I sat there, in the silence of that kitchen, the Maldives note, still lying on the table like a small, cruel truth, and I felt something sink deeper than hurt recognition. All morning I'd been trying to understand how my family could leave me, how they could plan a vacation without me. How they could sneak out before sunrise like I was a burden they needed to slip away from. But the truth was simpler than I wanted to admit. They'd been teaching me for years that I didn't matter. The signs weren't sudden. They were layered, stacked quietly, like dishes in a cupboard, one on top of another, until the whole thing finally toppled. I pressed my hands against the counter, grounding myself, and the memories began rolling back whether I wanted them to or not. It started small after college. I remember the day I moved home. I had planned to stay only 3 months, just until I found a decent studio apartment and settled into my first full-time job. But on my second week back, Dad mentioned his back pain, sighing dramatically as he lowered himself into a chair. "We could use the help," he said with a strained smile. "Just until we get things straight." And Mom chimed in, without missing a beat. "It's good to have you here, Claire. You're such a blessing. Stay a little longer, okay?" I told myself it was temporary. I always did. But a little longer slid into maybe after the holidays, which became once Sophie finishes her semester, and then your father needs you for his appointment, and suddenly a year had passed, and I was still there, still the convenient adult, daughter who lived at home and held everything together. One night, after an exhausting day of juggling my job and a pile of errands they'd dropped on me without asking, I came home to Mom sitting at the table with a list. "We need groceries," she said, "and Sophie's dress needs to be picked up tomorrow morning. Oh, and don't forget to call the insurance company, they've been giving us trouble." I remember nodding, automatically bone-tired, feeling like I was slipping into a role I never auditioned for. And then Dad looked up at me from across the table and said, "You look tired. Did you at least finish the laundry?" I felt something splinter inside me then. Just a tiny crack. I swallowed it down. Because that's what I always did. The financial request started just as quietly. Mom forgot to transfer money to pay the electric bill 1 month. Dad accidentally used the wrong card for groceries and asked if I could just cover it this time. Sophie needed supplies for school because she couldn't ask them, money was tight. It added up quickly, but I didn't track it. I wasn't thinking about fairness then, I was thinking about keeping the peace. Being a good daughter. Being dependable, useful, reliable. Reliable is a trap word. It sounds like praise the first dozen times you hear it. It feels like a compliment. It feels like you're important. But at some point, reliable stops meaning we appreciate you and starts meaning you'll do it because you always do. One morning, I woke up with a sore throat, feverish and shaking. I could barely stand. When I told Mom I needed to rest, she handed me the car keys and said, "Sophie can't miss practice today. Please don't start this, Claire. We're counting on you. Counting on me. Counting on me to function while sick. Counting on me to bend until I broke. Counting on me to be there so they never had to lift anything themselves." I drove Sophie that day dizzy and clammy, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me conscious. She didn't even look up from her phone. "You don't have to act like you're dying," she muttered. I think I realized then that she'd learned from them, learned how to treat me, learned what I was worth. There was another moment I'll never forget. I'd been offered a position in Seattle, better pay, better opportunities, a fresh start. I came home excited, breathless with possibility. But by the time I finished explaining it, my parents were both shaking their heads. "Who will help us if you leave?" Mom asked. Dad frowned and added, "We can't afford for you to move away right now. Think about the family, Claire. Think about the family. Think about the unit that functioned because I filled in every gap. Think about the work they didn't want to do, the errands they didn't want to run, the responsibilities they didn't want to carry. Think about everyone but myself." So I said no to the job, partly because of guilt, mostly because I was too used to hearing their voices louder than my own. After that, they became bolder. Whenever I tried to make plans for myself, they'd guilt me into canceling them. Whenever I expressed exhaustion, they'd accuse me of overreacting. Whenever I asked for help, they'd act confused, offended even. "We already do so much," Mom said once. "Why would you put more on us?" I'd been paying the utility bills for 6 months by then. I didn't argue. I rarely did. One afternoon, I overheard Sophie complaining to a friend over speakerphone. I was standing just outside her door, laundry basket in my arms. "My sister doesn't have a real life," she laughed. "She just stays home and helps. Mom says she's too sensitive to handle things anyway." The laundry basket slipped from my hands. I walked away quietly so she wouldn't see the way my face crumpled. And then there was the birthday. My 28th birthday came and went without a single word from my parents. I didn't remind them. I didn't want to make it about me. Instead, I sat with them at dinner as they talked about Sophie's upcoming audition. That night, Sophie knocked on my door and handed me a small gift bag. "Here," she said. "Mom told me to give you this like weeks ago." I forgot. She rolled her eyes. "Whatever." Inside was a mug with the word steady printed on it. Steady. Reliable. Invisible. Now, standing in the kitchen with the Maldives note in front of me, it was almost laughable how clearly everything aligned. My family leaving without me wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the natural conclusion to decades of small ones. They'd been slowly erasing me for years. I just didn't see it. I sank into a chair and rubbed my temples, feeling the grief settle heavily but cleanly like a truth I could finally touch. I'd spent my whole life shrinking to fit inside their expectations, folding myself small to avoid conflict, disappearing to make room for Sophie's needs. My parents' wants, the family's comfort. And what did all that shrinking earn me? A note telling me I wasn't part of the family trip, a choice made behind my back, a secret kept for months, a silent escape hours before sunrise so they wouldn't have to face me. I laughed under my breath, a soft, humorless sound. Maybe I wasn't disposable. Maybe I was just used to being treated that way. I picked up the note one more time and let the words settle into my skin without resistance. "You wouldn't enjoy the flight." They'd told themselves a story to justify what they were already planning. They'd convinced themselves they knew me well enough to speak for me. But a lie can't soften a blow, a story can't disguise a choice. My parents and Sophie didn't leave me out because they thought I'd be uncomfortable. They left me out because they didn't want me there. This wasn't the beginning of something new, it was the end of something old. And for the first time in my life, I let myself see it. I walked back into the kitchen and stared at the note again, but this time I didn't feel the sharp sting in my chest. Instead, I felt something colder, steadier, like the fog had finally lifted, and I could see the coastline beneath it. I reached for my phone with a sudden urgency and opened the Ring camera app. The little blue circle spun for a moment before the screen blinked to life. My breath caught. The timestamp at the bottom read 3:02 a.m. There they were. My mother in her oversized beige travel sweater dragging her suitcase across the porch like she was sneaking out of a stranger's home. My father followed carrying his duffel and Sophie's pink suitcase covered in stickers. Sophie trailed behind them, hood-up earbuds in, looking almost excited. They moved quietly, almost rehearsed like they'd practiced earlier in the week. My father kept glancing toward the house, checking for lights, checking for me. "Come on," I heard him whisper. "We have to go before she wakes up." I didn't know which part hit me harder, the whisper or the urgency in his voice. Sophie's voice was clearer. "Relax, Dad. Claire sleeps like a rock. She won't wake up until noon." Mom shushed her, but without real reprimand. "Just keep walking, sweetheart." The car's right there. I felt my fingers twitch around the phone. They hadn't simply forgotten to wake me. They hadn't overslept or rushed or miscommunicated. They had planned a clean getaway. Then, the part that made my stomach turn, Sophie stopped mid-porch and pulled something from her hoodie pocket, a small photo frame. She popped out the back, took out the photo inside, and tossed it into the bushes. I recognized that picture. It was from 2 summers ago, all 4 of us smiling at the Oregon coast. Windy, messy hair, happy. She'd removed my picture, then kept the frame. My mother noticed her fiddling and called softly, "Sophie, leave that." "It's fine," Sophie said. "I just don't want her in the photos we bring." My mother didn't argue. My father didn't even look. They kept walking. I pressed pause, staring at their faces, waiting for outrage, pain, something to crash over me, but instead there was a complete stillness inside. A clarity so sharp it almost felt like relief. They didn't love me the way I wanted them to. They hadn't for a long time, and I had been clinging to a version of them that only existed in my memory, not in reality. I scrolled forward in the footage, watching them load the car. Sophie dropped her tote bag at one point, and Mom picked it up with a laugh, brushing dirt off the strap. Dad kissed Mom's forehead before sliding into the driver's seat. They were happy, excited, united, and I was the shadow they were glad to leave behind. I closed the Ring app, set my phone down, and walked into the living room. The morning light slanted across the hardwood floor, making dust flicker like tiny sparks. This was the room where we'd celebrated birthdays, where I helped Sophie with homework, where we watched Christmas movies every year. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the truth sitting heavy in my chest. This wasn't my home. It never had been, not in the way I'd hoped. I walked to the wall where our last family portrait hung. It wasn't there. The nail was there. The faint dust outline was there. But the frame was gone. I checked the hall, gone. The living room, gone. The dining area, gone. Every family photo that had included me was missing. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling something inside me tilt then settle. They hadn't just excluded me from a trip. They had been removing me piece by piece long before I realized. I turned to the couch and sank down slowly. My body felt oddly light, as if I were floating slightly above myself. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. The clock ticked on the wall. Outside, a bird chirped once before flying away. Everything was the same, and nothing was. My eyes shifted to the stairs. Every room upstairs held something I'd bought, chosen, or contributed to. My parents never liked shopping for furniture. They had me do it, I remembered the day I ordered the new sofa. My mother had wanted something modern but warm, and I'd spent hours comparing colors before picking the cream one she adored. My father had said nothing at first, but when it arrived, he'd acted as though he had chosen it himself. I walked toward the kitchen and opened cabinets at random. The blender, my Christmas gift to Mom. The pots, my purchase when she complained the old ones were worn. The fridge, I had paid half for that after Dad said money was tight. They'd offered to pay me back. They never did. Everywhere I looked, my fingerprints were on the things they used daily. And yet I wasn't part of the family trip. I moved through the house slowly, as though walking through a museum of my own mistakes. I opened Sophie's room. Her backpack was gone, her shoes, her favorite jacket, but the desk I bought her last year, still there, the vanity mirror still screwed to the wall. The blue throw blanket I crocheted for her 17th birthday lay folded at the end of the bed. I stepped back, feeling an ache not sharp but dull and deep. The ache of seeing how much I'd given to people who barely saw me. My parents' room was next. I pushed open the door and looked around. Their suitcases were gone, the closet half empty, where they'd taken their travel clothes. The nightstand drawer was open slightly, so I nudged it with my foot. Inside was a packing list in my mother's handwriting. Passport, sunscreen, itinerary, camera, charger, Sophie's medicine, plain snacks. Check if Claire is asleep. Leave quietly. 3 seats confirmed. My hand tightened around the paper. That one line written casually in the middle of mundane items made something sting behind my eyes. Check if Claire is asleep. Leave quietly. 3 seats confirmed. They hadn't simply hoped I wouldn't wake, they'd planned for it. They'd verified it. They'd protected themselves from the possibility of facing me. I closed the drawer gently and sat on the edge of their bed. The mattress dipped slightly familiar and yet foreign. I remembered all the nights I'd walked into this room when Sophie was sick, when bills needed sorting, when something broke in the house. All the nights I'd stood in the doorway waiting to be told what to do. That girl felt far away now. Very far. I stood and took a long look around the room. The framed wedding photo on the dresser seemed to watch me. My mother's perfume bottle gleamed in the morning light. My father's watch lay neatly beside it. So many pieces of their lives. So few pieces of mine. I closed the door behind me and walked downstairs again. The house felt colder with every step, not in temperature but in spirit, like a place emptied long before the people left. I paused at the front door, resting my hand on the knob, feeling the weight of everything I'd learned in the past hour settle into place. This wasn't my home. This wasn't my family, not in a way that counted, not in a way that protected me. I let my hand drop to my side and took a slow breath. Enough, I whispered into the empty air. The word didn't echo. It settled. It rooted itself. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt something steady and certain rise inside me, not anger, not grief, but clarity. I wasn't going to spend one more day pretending I belonged where I clearly didn't. And I wasn't going to stay here waiting for people who never once stayed for me. The house felt too quiet to hold all the thoughts rushing through my head. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the outline on the wall where our family portrait used to hang, and for the first time all morning I didn't feel the ache of betrayal. Not sharply, not like a wound. I felt something steadier, almost peaceful. My grandmother once told me the day you stop explaining yourself is the day you get your life back. I didn't understand those words at the time. But standing there, surrounded by the echoes of a home filled with everyone's things except love for me, I felt those words settle like truth. My hands were no longer shaking, my breath felt even. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't clawing anymore. It wasn't frantic. It was quiet, a kind of mourning not for them, but for the version of me that had tried so hard for so long. As I stood there, my eyes drifted toward the kitchen window. Beyond the glass, the backyard looked exactly like it always did. Bare trees, damp grass, the old bird feeder Dad kept promising to fix. But to me, everything had shifted. Nothing felt warm anymore. It all looked like a place I had stayed in out of habit rather than belonging. I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, letting the cold air wash over me. Every food item inside, every container, every leftover, every carefully packed lunch felt like a record of how much caretaking I had done, how many small acts of service had become expected unnoticed. My mother's handwriting on the note still sat on the counter. We flew to the Maldives. It's a family trip. You wouldn't enjoy the flight. Family trip. Not my family. Not my trip. The words repeated in my mind like a slow, steady drum. And yet I felt strangely calm, like the worst thing that could happen had already happened, and now all that remained was clarity. I turned from the kitchen and moved slowly toward the front door. Every room I passed seemed to whisper something: the rug I bought, because Mom hated the old one; the lamp I picked out, because Dad kept saying the lighting was terrible; the bookshelf I assembled for Sophie because she wanted a place to display her trophies. It was as if the entire house was built on the pieces of me they'd taken. Every memory had roots in my effort, not theirs. I walked down the hallway, pausing in front of the guest bathroom. The small towel hanging on the rack was the one I'd bought during a sale last winter. I reached out, touched the soft fabric, and felt something shift. This towel was mine. That rug was mine. So much of this house, so much more than I had realized, was mine. Not symbolically, not emotionally, literally mine. "How much have I paid for?" I whispered. The answer wasn't pretty. I turned around and headed upstairs again, but this time not to cry or lament. I moved with purpose. My steps felt grounded, strong. I went into my bedroom first and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a folder, a simple blue folder with the elastic bands stretched thin. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of my bed. For years, I saved receipts without thinking. I liked being organized. I liked having records. Dad teased me for it, called me overly cautious. But now, flipping through the papers, I realized what I had: proof. The television, the sofa, the washer and dryer, the fridge, the cookware, the vanity in Sophie's room, the desk in the study, the lamp in the hallway. Page after page, my name was printed in black ink, my purchases, my bank account, my signature. I closed the folder slowly, my fingers resting on the cover. "It's all mine," I murmured, almost softly, almost in awe. The sentence didn't feel vengeful. It felt true, steady. A foundation shifting beneath me in a way that made space for something new. I stood and crossed the room, picking up my phone from the dresser. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind again. "Don't let the world make you small." I typed slowly, deliberately, moving company near me. A long list popped up. I scrolled, reading comments, checking ratings, scanning for something that felt right. One company stood out: family-owned, excellent reviews, known for being respectful with delicate situations. I clicked the number. The phone rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, bright and professional. "Northwest Premier Movers. This is Jacob. How can I help you?" I took a breath. A small tremor ran through me, but not from fear. From certainty. "I need to schedule a move," I said. "Absolutely. What date are you thinking?" "Tomorrow," I replied. Another pause. "Tomorrow? That's Thanksgiving weekend, ma'am. We can do it, but there's a holiday rate." "That's fine. I'll pay anything you need." The clicking of his keyboard echoed faintly through the phone. "All right. Name and address." I gave him everything he needed. My voice remained steady. When he asked whether this was a full house move or partial, I answered without hesitation. "I'll have a list ready." "It's quite a bit." "Not a problem," he said warmly. "We can be there at 8 in the morning. Does that work?" "That works perfectly." After we hung up, I stood there in the quiet room. The house didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt like a structure I was passing through on the way to something better. I pulled out a notepad from my drawer and wrote at the top items to move. The pen felt solid between my fingers as I began listing everything that belonged to me. Everything I had purchased. Everything they had taken for granted. One line, then another, then another. The list grew quickly, flowing down the page in neat handwriting. TV, sofa, coffee table, office chair. Kitchen appliances. Blender, mixer, cookware, dishes. Bookshelf, lamps, rugs. Washer, dryer, patio set. As I wrote, memories surfaced, not painful ones, but clarifying ones. The day I surprised them with a new refrigerator. Because the old one had finally died. Dad had said, "You really came through for us, kiddo." Mom had hugged me just long enough to make it look sincere. But the glow I felt then wasn't from gratitude, it was from believing I was finally part of something. Now I saw it differently. The day I bought the washer and dryer was after Dad complained about expenses. I had stepped in before he even asked, because that's who I was, the reliable one, the fixer, the convenient solution. But now I understood something important. Being useful is not the same as being valued. The house was quiet around me, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like a place waiting to be emptied, waiting for the truth to be put into action, waiting for me to claim what was mine and walk away. I finished my list, tore the page neatly, and placed it inside the blue folder along with the receipts. Then I sat back and let the weight of the moment wash over me. I wasn't running. I wasn't escaping. I was choosing. Choosing to stop shrinking. Choosing to stop begging. Choosing to stop explaining. Choosing to stop hoping they'd see me. Choosing myself. When I stood up again, something inside me felt taller. Tomorrow I would move. Tomorrow I would take back everything I bought. Tomorrow I would begin the life they never imagined I'd have the courage to build. And for the first time in my life, the silence in the house didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like freedom forming its shape. I woke before the sun, my body alert in a way it hadn't been in years. For a moment I lay still, listening to the silence of the house. But this time the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt purposeful, like the quiet before a decision becomes real. I got up, made myself a simple breakfast, and stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The list I wrote the night before sat neatly beside me, folded in half. I traced the crease with my fingertips, steady and calm. At 7:28, I heard the rumble of a truck pulling into the driveway. Right on time. I took a deep breath, set down the mug, and walked to the front door. Through the window, I saw a large white moving truck with bold blue lettering, Northwest Premier Movers. 3 men climbed out, one tall with sandy hair, one stocky with a trimmed beard, and one younger looking with a friendly uncertainty in his eyes. They pulled on work gloves as they approached the porch. I opened the door before they had a chance to knock. "Good morning," I said warmly. The tallest one smiled. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Jacob. This is Tyler and Marcus. Please come in." I made fresh coffee, and there are cookies on the counter. They exchanged surprised glances, probably used to frantic customers, not someone offering hospitality on moving day. But they stepped inside, gratefully wiping their boots on the mat. "Thank you," Jacob said. "People usually aren't this calm during a move." I gave a small smile. "I've been planning this for a long time." While they poured coffee, I reached for the blue folder and handed it to Jacob. "Here's the list," I said. "Everything I need moved today is in this house, and I have receipts for every piece. I'd like everything on the list loaded." Jacob flipped through the receipts, eyebrows rising a little. "This is very thorough documentation. I know exactly what's mine," I replied. "And that's all I'm taking." He nodded with newfound respect. "All right then. Let's start in the living room." I stepped aside as they headed toward the first room. Watching them walk in felt surreal, like I was watching someone dismantle a life I had built with my hands but had never been allowed to claim. The TV came first. They wrapped it carefully, securing each corner with thick blankets and tape. I remembered the Christmas morning. I'd surprised my parents with it, how my dad had clapped his hands together and said, "Look at that picture quality," as if he'd bought it himself. Marcus glanced at the photoless wall and muttered, "Feels weird taking everything out of a house this quiet." It's been quiet for a long time, I answered softly, just not in a peaceful way. They nodded and kept working. The couch was next. The cream-colored one, my mother insisted on the one I'd bought because she said it would make the living room look more put together. Watching the three men lift it, tilting it sideways to maneuver through the hallway, felt strangely liberating. Like every object they carried was one more weight I didn't have to bear. The coffee table, the rug, the end tables. Piece by piece, the living room became emptier, lighter. And so did I. In the kitchen, Tyler opened the fridge and blinked. "Ma'am, this is full. I left the food intentionally," I said. "They'll handle it." He nodded, then unplugged the fridge and helped Marcus wheel it out. The microwave, the blender, the espresso machine, the mixer. Every appliance I bought, because Mom mentioned wanting them someday. Every tool that had turned into my responsibility the moment it entered the house. Gone. By 11, the kitchen was stripped bare. When they moved to Sophie's room, I hesitated at the doorway for a moment. Not because I felt guilt I didn't, but because I wanted to mark the moment. Her vanity, which I'd bought for her 16th birthday. Her desk chair. The lamp she claimed she hated, though she used it every night. As Tyler unplugged the vanity mirror, something caught my eye under the dresser. A crumpled envelope. I reached down and pulled it out carefully. It was a birthday card. My birthday card. From 3 years ago. Sophie's messy handwriting filled the inside. "Happy birthday, Claire. I hope we celebrate tonight." Sophie, the envelope was sealed, never opened, never given. My mother's neat handwriting was on the corner, "Not now." A cold, steady breath escaped me. All those times I thought I wasn't worth celebrating. All those years of silence. All those birthdays that slipped past like they weren't mine. Not now. I folded the card gently and tucked it into my pocket. When the movers headed into the laundry room, the washer and dryer came next. I remembered how excited my parents had been when the old set finally died, saying it was a good excuse to upgrade. I was the one who paid for that upgrade. And now I was the one reclaiming it. "This is a nice set," Marcus said as he wheeled the dryer out. "It should be," I replied. "They were expensive," he chuckled. "Bet they'll freak out when they come back." "They already are," I said calmly. "They just don't know why yet." Jacob looked at me, pausing mid-wrap around the washer. "You sure you're okay?" "Yes," I answered truthfully. For the first time in a long time. By mid-afternoon, the house was nearly empty. The dining room echoed when I walked across it. The living room felt like an open shell. The kitchen counters were bare. The walls looked brighter without the weight of everything I once gave. Jacob approached me with the clipboard. "We're just about done. Do you want a final walkthrough?" I nodded. We walked through each room. My room was stripped down to essentials, clothes, books, personal items. Everything I truly owned. Everything I truly wanted. My parents' room felt like a hotel suite, big furniture, no heart. Sophie's room looked like a child's vacation rental, bold colors, unfinished energy. The house didn't feel like sadness anymore. It felt empty in the way you feel after clearing out a storage unit of things you no longer need. Back in the kitchen, I reached for the Maldives note. The turkey magnet still held it in place, cheerful and mocking. I pulled the magnet away, folded the note, and placed it neatly in the center of the counter. Beside it, I set the stack of unpaid bills I'd found earlier, the ones my mother pushed onto my card because there wasn't time to deal with that. Then I removed my house key from my keyring. 2 copies, both with little silver scratches from years of use. From a drawer, I found a thin ribbon, red soft satin. I tied the 2 keys together and placed them next to the note. A parting gift, a clear message, a clean ending. Jacob stood by the doorway watching quietly. "You ready?" I nodded once. "Yes." We stepped outside. The cold afternoon air wrapped around me, but it felt refreshing, not harsh. The moving truck was packed. My car waited in the driveway. I turned and looked at the house one last time. The windows stared back, blankly empty of the life that used to demand so much of me. I didn't feel grief. I felt release. As I climbed into my car, Jacob leaned out the truck window. Where to, I gave him the address of my new apartment, the place I'd toured alone last week without telling anyone. A place with soft light, quiet hallways, and no expectations. He nodded. We'll follow you. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, the house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a bend in the road. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. I was already moving forward. I hadn't even finished unlocking the door to my new apartment when my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. At first I ignored it. I wanted a moment, just one breath, to feel the stillness of this place I'd chosen for myself. So I stepped inside, exhaled, and let the door close behind me. The apartment smelled like new paint and fresh carpet. Sunlight poured through the blinds, landing gently on the sofa the movers had set up. My sofa, my space, my life. The phone buzzed again. And again. And again. I slipped it from my pocket, intending to silence it. Then I froze. 113 missed calls. My thumb hovered over the screen as the notifications kept stacking themselves one on top of another, calls, texts, voicemails. My parents' names, Sophie's name, unknown numbers. The sheer volume of it was almost absurd. The most recent message flashed at the top. Mom, Claire, pick up. The house has been robbed. Robbed. A quiet laugh slipped out of me, small, stunned, disbelieving. I walked slowly to the kitchen counter, set my phone down, and stood there watching as another text from Dad appeared. Dad, call me. Now. I pulled out a chair at the counter, sat down, and finally picked up the phone again. Not to reply, not to panic, but to scroll. Because if I had learned anything in the past 24 hours, it was this. Their crisis was not my emergency. I opened the Ring camera app. The footage was still there, cloud saved. I scrolled through the timeline until I reached the moment they returned home from the Maldives. The timestamp read 3:42 p.m. I tapped play. They tumbled into frame, all three of them dragging their suitcases behind them. Sun-kissed, relaxed, tan lines visible on their arms. Their hair slightly wine-tossed, clothes wrinkled from long travel. A perfect family returning from a perfect luxury vacation. A perfect family of three. Mom reached the porch first, tugging her roller bag behind her. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. She froze. Her suitcase slipped from her hand and tipped onto its side. Dad walked in behind her, still adjusting his neck pillow. He stopped abruptly. What the hell? His voice trailed off. Then Sophie entered, earbuds still dangling, scrolling on her phone. She glanced up, saw the empty living room, and her jaw dropped. Where's the couch? She shrieked. Mom stepped forward, hand pressed against her chest. Where's everything? Dad rushed deeper into the house, disappearing briefly from the camera's view. When he returned, he looked wild, frantic. The TV is gone. The rug is gone. The table's Claire's room. Everything's gone. Sophie's voice cracked as she screamed. My vanity, my mirror, my desk. They took my stuff too. I leaned back in my chair, watching as they spun in panic circles, touching empty spaces where furniture used to be, opening cabinets, opening closets, shouting over each other. I should have felt guilty. I didn't. Watching them panic felt like watching a play where I finally understood I was never meant to be cast in the starring role. Mom fumbled for her phone and hit 911 with shaking fingers. Yes, I'd like to report a robbery, she said breathlessly. Our entire house has been emptied. Everything is gone. I took a sip of the water I'd poured earlier and kept watching. Dad paced like a caged animal. How did someone get in? How did someone take this much? This is insane, Sophie flailed her arms. This is why you don't leave the house for 10 days. I told you this was a bad idea. Mom ignored her. The fridge is gone. They took the fridge, and the moment she said it, something inside me settled deeper. A bone-level clarity. A truth I had been slowly growing into since the morning they left. This was not my responsibility. I tapped into the saved voicemails. The first one was from Mom, her voice high and panicked. "Claire, honey, where are you? We just got home. Something's happened, call me. Please." The next was from Dad, trying hard to mask his anger behind calm. "Claire, it's Dad. I need you to call us immediately. Do you understand, immediately?" Then Sophie's voice burst through the speaker, hysterical. "If you know anything you need to tell us. This is serious, Claire. Don't be selfish for once." For once. The corner of my mouth tightened. Voicemail after voicemail played, fear turning to irritation, irritation turning to outright accusation. Then came the one that made me pause. Mom's whisper, terrified but careful. "Do you think Claire did this?" Dad hissed back. "Don't say that on a recording." I closed my eyes for a moment. Of course they thought that. Not because it made sense, but because it was easier to blame me than face the truth of their own choices. I scrolled further through the messages. "Mom, when did you last see the house?" "Mom, answer your phone right now." "Dad, this is a criminal matter, Claire. Sophie, you always ruin everything." "Sophie, this is why we didn't want you on the trip." That one made me stop. I zoomed in on the screenshot of the text. "We didn't want you on the trip. Not we thought you'd be uncomfortable. Not we weren't sure you'd be able to get off work. Not we didn't think you'd enjoy it. Just the truth I had waited a decade to hear. They didn't want me. Not physically, not emotionally, not in their family narrative. And for the first time in my life, hearing it didn't shatter me. It steadied me." My phone buzzed again. Another call from Dad. I let it ring. Then ring again. Then go silent. I brought up the ring footage again, fast-forwarding. Police officers arrived 20 minutes later. I watched the conversations unfold silently from my counterstool, officers taking notes, my parents gesturing wildly, Sophie sobbing in indignation. Dad held up a hand emphatically. "We didn't give anyone permission to take anything." Someone broke in. One officer asked, "Do you have receipts for the missing items?" Mom faltered. "Well, not exactly, but they were in our home. They're ours." The officer scribbled something and looked skeptical. Dad ran a hand through his hair. "My daughter Claire, she lives with us. Or she did. She might know something." Sophie snapped, "She must know something. She's been acting weird." Acting weird. I almost laughed. If weird meant waking up to the truth, then yes. Yes, I was. When the officers left, my parents slumped onto the bare living room floor, surrounded by emptiness. Sophie buried her face in her hands. They looked small, not vulnerable, not wounded, just exposed. I closed the app quietly and set down my phone. The sun was drifting lower outside the window, warming the edges of my new living room. My sofa, my books, my lamp, my things glowed softly in the light. I took a slow breath. For the first time in years, I felt safe. My phone buzzed one more time. "Sophie, you did this, didn't you?" "Sophie, answer me." "Sophie, how could you?" I locked the screen and placed the phone gently face down on the table. Let them scream into the void. Let them search for answers. Let them wonder. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't explaining anymore. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I walked to the window and looked out over the city. My new view, my new life, my new beginning. And in the soft, fading light, I whispered to myself the truth they never wanted me to learn. They taught me how to disappear. They just didn't expect I'd do it on my own terms. I had just finished unpacking a box of dishes when 3 sharp knocks hit my front door, firm, professional, unmistakable. I froze for half a second, plate in hand, before setting it quietly on the counter. Portland Police Department. I closed my eyes and let out a slow, steady breath. I knew this moment would come. I straightened my shoulders, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked calmly to the door. When I opened it, 2 officers stood in the hallway. One younger, clean jawline, alert eyes. The other older, broader, seasoned, someone who had seen enough family drama to know it before anyone spoke. "Miss Claire Morgan?" the younger one asked. "Yes," I answered, stepping aside. "Come in." They exchanged a glance. People usually hesitated before inviting the police inside, but they stepped in respectfully. My apartment looked warm and bright in the morning light. The sofa the movers had set, my bookshelf, my lamp. Everything placed with intention, everything peaceful. I gestured toward the small table. Coffee, water. The older officer smiled faintly. "We're fine, ma'am. We're here because your family reported a burglary at your previous residence." I nodded. "I'm aware they made a report." The younger officer pulled out a notebook. They indicated the entire house was emptied while they were away. "Furniture, appliances, electronics." I waited. "And they suggested," he continued carefully, "that you may have information about the incident." I didn't flinch. "I do." Both officers paused as if they didn't expect such a direct answer. The older man leaned slightly forward. "Miss Morgan, did you remove items from the property?" "Yes," I said. "Everything I removed belongs to me." A silence followed, one of evaluation, not accusation. "Do you have proof of ownership?" the older officer asked. "I do," I replied, turning to retrieve the blue folder on my kitchen counter. I placed it gently on the table between us. Every receipt, every purchase, every item they reported missing was bought by me. With my money. The younger officer flipped open the folder. His eyebrows rose slowly. "These are incredibly organized." "I keep good records," I said simply. They flipped through pages: TV receipt, sofa purchase, washer, dryer, invoice, credit card statements, screenshots of appliance orders. Everything labeled, everything dated, everything undeniably mine. The older officer tapped a particular page. "This is the refrigerator, yes, and this is the washer and dryer, yes." He looked up at me with something almost like respect. "Your family claimed these belonged to them." I met his gaze. "My family claims a lot of things." The younger one cleared his throat. "They told us no one else had permission to enter the property. They didn't mention that you lived there." "Lived," I repeated the word, soft but edged. Past tense. The officers looked at each other again, this time with clarity. "Miss Morgan," the older officer said slowly, "from what I see here, there's no theft. You are legally entitled to take anything you purchased." The knot in my stomach loosened, not because I feared consequences, but because I'd spent so long being told my reality didn't matter. Having it affirmed by someone objective felt steadier than I expected. "May I ask," the older officer added gently, "why you moved out so suddenly?" I considered the question, then answered honestly. "They left for the Maldives on Thanksgiving without telling me. Left a note. A family trip. 3 seats." I woke up alone in an empty house. The younger officer's expression softened. "They left you behind." "On purpose," I said. He let out a breath as if the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. "We see situations like this," the older officer murmured. "Not often, but often enough." I nodded. The younger officer closed the folder and placed it back on the table with care. "We'll be closing the case as a civil matter. There's no crime here." Another weight lifted. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. Just then, the older officer's radio crackled. He listened for a second, then stepped aside to answer a call. I didn't strain to hear, but a few words drifted over. "Yes, we're with her. Receipts confirm." "No, sir, it's not theft." I didn't have to guess who was on the other end of that call. When he returned, he slid his business card across the table. "If your family continues to contact you in a harassing manner, call this number directly." I nodded, taking the card carefully. "Thank you, truly." A sudden burst of voices echoed faintly down the hallway, familiar voices, sharp and frantic. Sophie's shriek was unmistakable. "She has to be here." "Check the door." The younger officer stiffened. The older one sighed. "Looks like they figured out where you moved." Before I could say anything, they positioned themselves near the door. I followed them into the hallway just as the elevator dinged open. My family spilled out like a broken dam. Mom with red blotchy eyes, Dad with a clenched jaw, Sophie wild and furious. The moment they saw me standing beside 2 uniformed officers, they froze. Mom rushed forward first. "Claire, oh my God, why didn't you answer your phone? How could you just vanish?" And the house. Claire, our house, everything is gone. Dad jabbed a finger toward me. Officer, she took items from our home. She needs to return them immediately. The younger officer lifted a hand calmly. Mr. Morgan, your daughter provided full documentation of ownership. Everything she moved belongs to her. Mom blinked rapidly. That can't be right. She bought those things for the family. For herself, the officer corrected gently. Her name is on every purchase. Sophie stepped forward, voice rising. You stole from us. How could you do this to your own family? I felt nothing. No guilt, no heat. Only distance. The older officer spoke firmly. There is no theft here. This case is closed. I recommend you all leave before this becomes a disturbance. Dad sputtered. You're taking her side. No, the officer replied. We're following the law. Mom looked at me like I was a stranger. Claire, how could you? Something inside me shifted into place, calm, unshakable. I took what I paid for, I said quietly. Sophie hissed. You ruined everything, you're selfish. I turned to her slowly. You didn't even want me on the trip. Her face went white. Before she could form another word, the older officer stepped between us. All of you need to leave. Now. Dad opened his mouth to argue, but Mom grabbed his sleeve. Richard, let's go. Sophie glared through tears but followed. The officers waited until the elevator closed and the voices faded. The hallway fell quiet again. You handled that well, the younger officer said softly. I exhaled a long, steady breath that felt like shedding an entire life. Thank you, I whispered, for seeing the truth. The officers nodded politely before heading out, leaving me at my doorway. I stepped back inside my apartment, closed the door gently, and leaned against it. The silence was warm again. Safe. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt entirely untethered from them, like a rope that had finally been cut. I walked to the window, sunlight stretching across my living room in soft golden streaks, and whispered to myself, they didn't expect me to stand up, and they never imagined I'd stand alone. But here I was, and I wasn't afraid. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped neatly under my door like an afterthought. I picked it up on my way to make coffee, thinking it was just another apartment notice or a delivery message. But when I turned the envelope over and saw the county courthouse seal, my fingers tightened. I set it on the counter, staring at it for a moment. Then I reached for the kettle, filled it, and set it to boil. I didn't want to open the envelope yet, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted a clear head. Hot water, a steady breath, and then the truth. When the kettle clicked off, I poured my tea, sat at the little table by the window, and broke the seal. The words blurred for a moment before settling into clarity. Small claims court summons plaintiffs. Richard Morgan Evelyn, Morgan Sophie, Morgan amount claimed $12,000, reason emotional distress, partial theft intentional, infliction of hardship. My lips parted in a slow, disbelieving exhale. There it was, the next escalation, the next attempt at control. I let the paper fall gently onto the table and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. They were suing me. Not because they had any legal ground, not because anything had been stolen, but because the police refused to punish me for them. Because for the first time in my life, I'd done something they couldn't undo. Something they couldn't guilt me into reversing. Something they couldn't shape into their narrative. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel wounded. All I felt was tired. A deep, old tiredness, like the kind you feel after carrying someone's weight for years, only now realizing how heavy it actually was. I took a sip of tea and looked at the summons again. $12,000. Emotional damages. I almost laughed. The emotional damage I'd taken from them would have cost far more if I'd ever chosen to calculate it. I folded the paper quietly and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I reached for the blue folder on my bookshelf. The one with every receipt, every purchase, every scrap of proof that I had never taken anything that wasn't mine. As I flipped through it, each page felt more like armor than paper, layer upon layer of truth I'd held onto, without knowing I'd someday need it. A soft knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, Maria stood there, holding a small container of soup. "You look pale," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Bad news." I handed her the envelope. She read it once, then twice. Her eyebrows rose. "They're suing you." After everything, I nodded. "Apparently, they think the court can punish me where the police couldn't." Maria set the envelope down and shook her head. "Mihija, this isn't a case. It's a tantrum written on official paper." I couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at my mouth. "I know, but I still have to show up." "Then show up prepared," she replied. "You don't need a lawyer, just the truth." I knew she was right. The hearing was scheduled for early December, 2 weeks from now. Enough time to prepare, but not enough time for dread to grow roots. And I wasn't interested in dread anymore. When the morning of the trial arrived, the sky hung low with heavy gray clouds threatening snow that stubbornly refused to fall. I dressed carefully, charcoal coat, simple dress, hair pulled back. I looked in the mirror and saw someone calm, someone ready, someone done apologizing. The courthouse buzzed with people. When I arrived, lawyers, shuffling papers, couples whispering anxiously, families arguing in low tones. I found the correct courtroom and sat on a hard wooden bench near the wall. I didn't have to wait long. They arrived together. My parents walked stiffly, faces tight. Sophie trailed behind, arms crossed, gaze sharp with bitterness. They saw me instantly, and a strange hush seemed to fall around us. Mom whispered something to Dad, her voice trembling with anger or desperation, I couldn't tell. Sophie glared openly, as if daring me to flinch. I didn't. When our case was called, we walked inside. The judge entered, a middle-aged man, with kind eyes but a no-nonsense posture. We all stood. We all sat. "Case number 4782, he announced. "Morgan versus Morgan. Plaintiffs, you may begin." My parents moved to the plaintiff's table. My mother spoke first, her voice quivering just the right amount. "Your Honor, our daughter removed property from our home without our permission. She left us with nothing, no furniture, no appliances, no belongings." Dad leaned in. "We returned from a family trip to find our house stripped. We suffered emotional trauma, financial hardship. She caused significant distress." Sophie chimed in loudly, "I can't even sleep in my room anymore. It's empty. She took everything." The judge nodded, slowly taking notes. When they finished, he turned to me. "Miss Morgan, how do you respond?" I stood, smoothing the front of my coat. "Your Honor, I removed only items I purchased myself. I have receipts and documentation for everything I took." I approached the bench and handed the blue folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. He opened it. Silence filled the room, except for the soft turning of pages. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly as he scanned each section: washer and dryer, sofa, refrigerator, kitchen appliances, furniture, lamps. My name printed clearly on every line. He looked up. "Miss Morgan, this is extremely thorough." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said softly. "I keep good records." He turned to my parents. "Do you have receipts to show that any of the items in question were purchased by you?" Dad's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Well, no, but she bought them for the household. They were gifts." "They were not gifts," I corrected gently. "I lived in the house. I bought what the household needed and was told I would be reimbursed for several larger items." Mom shot up from her seat. "We never agreed to that." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Morgan, please stay seated." Her face flushed red, but she sat. He kept reading. Then he paused at the printed screenshots, group chats from the Maldives planning thread. His eyes narrowed. "Finally, a real family trip," he read aloud. My parents' faces drained of color. Sophie shifted in her seat. The judge continued, "Miss Morgan, were you invited on this trip?" "No, Your Honor." "Did your family tell you they were leaving?" "No." "Did they leave you a note?" "Yes." "Did the note refer to it as a family trip?" "Yes," I said, steady. He closed the folder. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, he began gently. Emotional distress claims require evidence of deliberate harm or negligence. Your daughter removing items she legally owns does not qualify. Sophie whispered something fierce under her breath. He turned fully to the plaintiffs. Additionally, you have no receipts to support your claims of ownership. This is a civil misunderstanding, not theft. Dad's jaw tightened. But she left us with nothing. The judge shook his head. She left you with only what belonged to you. Case dismissed. A gavel struck. My breath left me in a quiet release. Mom gasped as if she'd been slapped. Sophie glared at me with pure hatred. Dad stared at the judge as though willing him to reconsider. But it was over. I gathered my folder, slipped it back into my purse, and walked past them toward the door. As I passed their table, Sophie hissed, "You'll regret this." I paused just for a moment. "No," I said softly. I regretted staying. And then I walked out into the cold December air, the sky heavy and quiet snow finally beginning to fall soft, melting free. Like me, I woke the next morning with a sensation I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't dread. It wasn't the familiar heaviness of obligation. It wasn't the quiet ache that used to settle in my chest before I even opened my eyes. It was peace. Soft, steady, uncomplicated peace. For a long moment I lay in bed, staring at the pale gold light filtering through my curtains. No footsteps outside my door, no sharp voices, no tension humming in the walls. Just warmth, stillness, and a morning that belonged entirely to me. I slid out of bed, pulled on a sweater, and padded into the kitchen. The apartment felt different today, as if it were breathing with me. I made coffee, my coffee strong and simple, and carried the mug to the balcony. The air outside was crisp, scented with wet pavement and pine. Below me, the Willamette River glimmered in the early sun. Ripples danced across the surface like the world was quietly waking up. I leaned on the railing, looked out at the water, and whispered without thinking, "I don't miss them." Not this morning, not at all. Saying it out loud felt like setting something down, something I'd been carrying too long. I went back inside and glanced at my small dining table. Last night before bed, I'd left a sticky note in the center. "I choose peace." I picked it up, smiled to myself, and stuck it to the fridge. Then I began unpacking. One small box at a time, not rushing, not tidying for anyone else. Just opening space for myself in a home that was finally mine. The first box held a lamp I'd bought years ago, the one my mother insisted was too quirky for her taste. I placed it on the side table beside the sofa and turned it on. A warm amber glow spread across the room. The second box contained framed prints I'd collected over the years. Art I loved but was told didn't match the aesthetic of the old house. I hung them carefully on the blank wall, each nail tap feeling like a declaration. My taste matters here. My choices count here. I count here. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door to find Maria holding a small plate covered in foil. "Breakfast," she said with a gentle smile. "You shouldn't start your first peaceful weekend making your own." I laughed softly and let her in. She looked around at the half-unpacked boxes and the sunlight catching the dust in soft clouds. "It's already feeling like home," she said. "You have a way of doing that." Her words warmed me more than the coffee had. No judgment, no expectation, just kindness. We sat for a few minutes eating warm sweetbread and talking about weekend plans. She mentioned a book club meeting on Tuesday, inviting me with a knowing look that made me feel welcome without feeling obligated. After she left, I decided to take a walk. The neighborhood was alive in a quiet, charming way. Dog walkers, couples holding coffee cups, a runner listening to music, a few early Christmas decorations blinking from windows. I felt like part of something. Not the center, not the caretaker. Just a person moving freely in the world. At a small cafe on the corner, music drifted out from the open door. Someone was playing guitar. Soft jazz carried onto the sidewalk, mingling with the scent of vanilla and roasted beans. I stood there for a moment, savoring a feeling I hardly recognized. Curiosity. Not anxiety, not duty. Just simple human curiosity. By midday, I had returned home with a pastry and a small potted plant I didn't need but desperately wanted. I set the plant on the windowsill, stepped back, and admired it. My apartment looked different already, softer, warmer, more me. In the afternoon, I tackled another box and found something I hadn't seen in years, an old notebook with a worn blue cover. I flipped it open. On the first page, written in my college handwriting, "Make a life that feels like yours." I pressed my thumb against the words, a slow smile forming. I hadn't made that life back then. I'd been too busy making sure everyone else's life ran smoothly, too tired to dream, too tangled in their expectations. But now I was building it one piece at a time. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging books, folding blankets, organizing the closet, humming softly to myself without realizing it. The hours drifted by gently like waves against a dock. Just before sunset, I found an envelope tucked inside one of the boxes. The handwriting on the front made my breath catch. Grandma. My hands shook not with fear, but with the weight of memory as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter she'd written years ago, one I didn't even remember receiving. Claire, you are stronger than you think. You deserve softness, not strain. Don't shrink yourself for people who won't grow. Choose the life that lets you breathe. And at the bottom, a final line. When the time comes, leave without guilt. My throat tightened. Tears gathered in my eyes, not from sadness, but from being seen. Really seen by someone who loved me without conditions. I placed the letter carefully inside a frame and set it beside my bed. As the sky turned shades of gold and rose, I made dinner something simple and comforting, then curled up on the sofa with a blanket Sophie once mocked for being grandma-ish. It felt warm now, like a cocoon. Before bed, I checked my phone. A few messages from coworkers, a sale alert from a store. Nothing from my family. The absence didn't hurt. It felt spacious. I put the phone away, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and stepped onto the balcony. The river reflected the city lights in shimmering strokes. Cars whispered by far below. Somewhere, someone was laughing. I closed my eyes and let the breeze brush across my face. I didn't lose anything worth keeping, I whispered. I gained something I never had, myself. When I went back inside, I turned off all the lights except the warm glow of that quirky lamp my mother hated. It cast a soft halo across the room, a room filled with peace, independence, and beginnings. I crawled into bed feeling steady for the first time in years. I wasn't fully healed yet, but healing had finally started, and this time it belonged only to me. Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly, soft sunlight spilling across my bedroom floor like a gentle reminder that this year would be different. I woke without an alarm, without dread, without the familiar heaviness that used to settle in my chest before holidays. For a long, peaceful moment, I simply lay there, listening to the hum of my apartment, my sanctuary, my space, my life. When I finally rose, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candle I'd burned the night before. I padded into the kitchen barefoot and pulled open the curtains. The morning light warmed my face, and I felt something inside me unlock. This year, I whispered to the empty room, I'm not waiting for anyone to show up. There was no ache in the words, only truth. I brewed coffee, let the steam warm my hands, and stepped onto the balcony. Below me, the courtyard was calm, dotted with fallen leaves and the early stirrings of neighbors preparing their own meals. Laughter drifted faintly from someone's open window. A dog barked. A breeze carried the soft, unmistakable scent of roasted herbs. It was Thanksgiving morning, and for the first time in my life, it felt like a day I wanted to keep. I set the coffee down and glanced at the unopened envelope on my dining table. The one that had arrived late last night, addressed in handwriting I recognized too well. Mom's curves, her neat loops. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I moved back into the kitchen and began preparing the simple meal I was hosting later. Nothing extravagant. Just a small dinner for four: me, Maria, Mr. Green from downstairs, and Louise from book club. The people who had become my unexpected little constellation of comfort. My chosen holiday circle. I seasoned the turkey, chopped herbs, peeled potatoes while humming softly to myself. No one hovered over my shoulder. No one asked why I did things a certain way. No one criticized, compared, or corrected. It was just me. And peace. As I slid the turkey into the oven, a realization settled deep in my chest. This was my first Thanksgiving where I wasn't performing for anyone. My thoughts wandered back to last year, cold silence, a note on the counter, an empty driveway. I remembered standing in the kitchen holding their words in trembling hands. It's a family trip. 3 seats. You wouldn't enjoy the flight. But the memory didn't stab anymore. It felt like watching a scene from someone else's life, distant and blurred at the edges. A knock interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, Maria stood there balancing a still warm pie and smiling like sunshine. Happy Thanksgiving, Querida. Come in, I said, hugging her lightly. And thank you. Soon after, Louise arrived with a shimmering glass bowl of cranberry sauce, followed by Mr. Green with a bag of rolls from his favorite bakery. They filled my apartment with lively conversation, warm smells, and the kind of easy companionship I never knew I'd been missing until I finally had it. We cooked together, passing dishes, laughing over shared mistakes, teasing one another like an old-found family. When we finally sat down to eat, the table looked beautiful. My mother's china, now mine, glistened in the candlelight. Well then, Louise said, placing her hands down gently, shall we say, grace? We bowed our heads and she spoke simply, thank you for good food, good friends, and new beginnings. When we lifted our heads, something tightened in my throat, the soft, almost tender realization that I had never experienced a Thanksgiving like this. Never one made of gratitude that didn't hurt. Never one where I didn't feel out of place at my own table. We ate slowly, talking about books and movies and recipes, about nothing heavy and everything comforting. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Green asked gently, "Any plans to see your family today?" I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. No, I said, not this year. And the certainty of it surprised me in a steady, grounding way. After dinner, we walked through the neighborhood, the 4 of us bundled against the cool air. Kids played in piles of leaves. A house down the block had already put up Christmas lights. Someone was frying something that smelled sweet, and the scent drifted down the street like a holiday ghost. When we returned, they hugged me tightly, promising we'd do this again before the holidays. I watched them walk down the hall, their laughter echoing softly. When I stepped back inside, the apartment felt warm, lived in, filled with the residue of joy. I cleaned up slowly, humming as I ran warm water over dishes, the kind of humming that happens only when you're content without realizing it. Then, as I placed the last dish on the drying rack, my laptop chimed. I dried my hands and opened it. A new email. From Sophie. Subject: should we talk? Someday. My breath caught not sharply but with the soft ache of something complicated. The email was short. Claire, I don't know what to say. I'm not good at saying sorry, but maybe we should talk. When you're ready. Sophie. I stared at the message, not moving, not feeling pulled or panicked. Just present. I didn't delete it. I didn't answer it either. I simply closed the laptop. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from an unknown number. The voice was unmistakable. Dad, Claire, we hope you're doing well. Let us know if you ever need anything. No anger, no demands, just a tired, unfamiliar softness. A man unsure of his place. I saved the voicemail not as hope, not as forgiveness, just as a marker of distance. A sign that the past was still shifting even if it couldn't be repaired. As I turned off the lights, Maria knocked lightly on my door again. One more thing, she said, smiling. Remember, you don't owe anyone access to your peace. I hugged her, grateful. After she left, I settled onto the balcony with a cup of tea. The night was cool, the city lights shimmering like scattered stars. The quiet felt sacred. Inside, my phone stayed silent. No demands. no guilt, no expectations, only space, only me. I gazed at the sky as the steam from my tea curled upward, vanishing into the dark. This had been a good Thanksgiving, a gentle one, a healing one, and as I finished the last sip of tea, I whispered into the night I wasn't healed yet, but for the first time in my life I finally have a place to heal. And I meant every word. The morning sunlight stretched across my living room floor, warm and gentle, like the world itself was easing into a new season. Winter had settled into Portland softly. No dramatic storms, just a steady hush of cold air and pale skies. I'd woken early not from anxiety or habit, but because peace had a way of filling my lungs before the day even started. I wrapped myself in a thick cardigan and walked to the balcony, sipping the first quiet coffee of the morning. Below, the river shimmered with faint ripples, and the walkway beside it was already dotted with early joggers and bundled-up dog walkers. Life moving forward, life continuing, life I was finally part of. As I breathed in the crisp air, I felt the steady hum of something I hadn't recognized in myself in a long time: contentment. Not the fragile kind that depended on other people behaving or approving. This was the kind built from the inside out. After a few moments, I went back inside and set my mug on the small table by the sofa. My apartment felt lived in now. Books stacked near the window, a blanket thrown over the couch, the plant on the sill leaning toward the sun, the framed letter from Grandma watching over me like quiet encouragement. I opened the closet to grab my coat for my morning walk and paused. There, hanging neatly in the back, was the coat my mother bought me years ago. A deep charcoal wool, beautiful but heavy. She had picked it out, insisting it suited me even though I'd always felt swallowed inside it. I ran my hand down the sleeve and felt the familiar weight settle in my chest. For a moment I considered giving it away, but instead I slid it off the hanger and held it. "Not today," I whispered, as if speaking to an old version of myself still tucked away inside the fabric. I hung it back up and reached for my own coat, the lighter one I'd bought just a month ago, soft blue, cozy, worn at the edges where my hands warmed the pockets. Mine. I stepped outside into the hallway just as Maria cracked open her door across the way. "Walk?" she asked, raising her eyebrows knowingly. I smiled. Always. We walked along the river path in easy silence, our footsteps crunching lightly against the frosted pavement. The sun was just beginning to stretch, fully awake, bathing everything in a pale glow. "You seem lighter," Maria said after a while. "I am," I replied simply. "This year feels different." "It should," she said. "You made it different." Her words lingered in the air, warm despite the cold. We walked until our breath formed soft clouds, until the quiet between us turned comfortable and full. When we returned to the apartment building, she squeezed my arm once before heading inside. At a small cafe on the corner, music drifted out from the open door. Someone was playing guitar. Soft jazz carried onto the sidewalk, mingling with the scent of vanilla and roasted beans. I stood there for a moment, savoring a feeling I hardly recognized. Curiosity. Not anxiety, not duty. Just simple human curiosity. By midday, I had returned home with a pastry and a small potted plant I didn't need but desperately wanted. I set the plant on the windowsill, stepped back, and admired it. Finally, I tapped the message. "Hey, I hope your Thanksgiving was nice. I'm sorry about everything. I'm still figuring things out. Maybe we can talk in January only if you want to." I let the words settle. There was no cruelty, no manipulation. Just a 17-year-old girl trying, maybe for the first time in her life, to reach out without expecting something in return. I didn't reply. Not yet. Some things deserve time, not silence, but time. I set the phone down and returned to the kitchen. My knife moved rhythmically, and the scents of garlic and herbs began to fill the room. As evening approached, I set my dinner on the table and lit 2 candles, small ones, that flickered, gently casting waves of warm light across the apartment. I sat down alone, but not lonely. Not anymore. Afterward, I filled a mug with tea and curled up on the sofa. The city outside my window glittered in small, perfect points of lights from homes, from street lamps, from holiday decorations, already shimmering on balconies and porches. I thought of the house I'd left behind, the silence, the coldness, the note that had reshaped everything. I thought of the Maldives trip. I was never meant to be part of the panic on their faces when they returned the courtroom, the judge's firm dismissal. And then slowly I thought of now, this room, this peace. This life I'd built piece by piece, truth by truth. I reached for my journal and wrote a line across the page. I am finally living a life where I am not shrinking. The words pulled a long, steady breath from my lungs. Later, I stepped onto the balcony one more time. The night felt gentle, wrapped in soft winter stillness. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant hum of traffic, the wind brushing against the building, the quiet confidence settling in my bones. I didn't lose anything, I whispered into the cold air. I reclaimed everything. A warmth spread through me, stronger than anger, deeper than independence. A sense of coming home to myself. And maybe someday there would be a conversation with Sophie. Maybe not. Maybe one day my parents would change. Maybe they wouldn't. But none of those maybes held power over me now. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't trying to earn a place at a table that never belonged to me. I had built my own. And it was enough. More than enough. Before I went back inside, I looked up at the sky, soft, dim, and endless. "Grandma," I whispered, smiling, I finally left without guilt. Inside, I settled onto the sofa, pulled a blanket over my lap, and let the peaceful weight of the day settle into my bones. And then I turned to you, yes, you, the one listening to my story. Because if you're here with me now, maybe this story found you for a reason. Maybe you've felt unseen. Maybe you've been taken for granted. Maybe you've been carrying more than anyone realizes. Maybe you're standing at the edge of a choice you're afraid to make. So let me say this gently but truthfully. You deserve peace. You deserve a life that feels like yours. You deserve to choose yourself without guilt. If my story resonated with you even just a little, I'd love for you to tell me in the comments. Share your thoughts, your own experiences, or just let me know you're here. It means more to me than you know. And if you want more stories like this, stories of strength, of healing, of quiet revenge that becomes transformation, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you're allowed to take your life back.